Okay, let's dive right in. We're about to pull back the curtain on the secret history of the Easter Bunny, and I gotta tell you, it's a wild story of supposed goddesses, modern myths, and a historical detective case that might just change how you see this holiday mascot forever. You've seen them. Every single spring, they pop up on social media like clockwork. These really slick infographics and viral posts, and they all tell the exact same, very tempting story. The story goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, there was this powerful Anglo-Saxon goddess named Yostre. She had a sacred hare, and then, boom, the church rolls in and just rebrands her ancient fertility festival. It's one of those hidden history stories that just feels, well, it feels too juicy not to be true, right?
But what if it's not true? What if this entire compelling narrative is just built on, well, nothing? Today, we're going to put on our detective hats and really investigate the case of the pagan bunny. And what we find, or more importantly, what we don't find, is where this whole thing gets really fascinating.
All right, any good investigation starts by looking at the evidence. So let's track down our two main players here, the goddess Istra and her supposedly sacred hare. So first up, Eostri. Now, you'd think if she was this major goddess, we'd find her name all over the place, wouldn't we? You know, in old texts, poems, carved into stones, but what does the actual historical record show? Get ready for this. This is the total number of ancient texts that ever mention a goddess by the name of Istre. Not a library, not a book, just one. A single lonely mention. And that one mention? It comes from a monk, the Venerable Bede, way back in the 8th century. And here's the real kicker. Even he was just guessing. He basically said, hey, maybe this month was named after a goddess. That is literally it. That's the entire ancient case for a store. Okay, so the evidence for the goddess is, let's say, incredibly thin. But what about her sidekick, the hare? The sacred hare is the whole reason we're talking about this. Surely there's got to be more evidence for that, right? Well, about that, this is how many times Bede, our one and only source for Eostre, connects her to a hare, or a rabbit, or an egg for that matter. Yep, 0. The connection just isn't there in the only text that supposedly started it all. I mean, the primary sources are totally silent. The experts are crystal clear. The whole foundation of this pagan bunny myth is basically built on thin air. The two most important pieces of the puzzle, they just don't exist. So, if the Easter bunny isn't some ancient pagan symbol, then what in the world is it? Well, let's turn to what the historical records actually say, because the real story is so much more recent, and frankly, way more interesting. Just look at this timeline. So, Christians have been celebrating Easter for centuries. Then, Bede writes his one little sentence about a goddess that might have existed, and then radio silence for almost 1,000 years. The Easter hare doesn't show up in writing until 1682. That is a huge gap in the story. So where do we finally meet our bunny? Not in some ancient pagan scroll, no. It's in a German medical dissertation from the 17th century. A professor just casually mentions it as this cute little story, a fable that parents tell their kids about a hare that hides eggs for them to find. It was never about religion, it was about folklore. So let's just lay it all out. The myth is an ancient goddess, a sacred hare, a religious ritual. The reality? 17th century folklore, a whimsical little fable, and a fun game for kids. This isn't a story about a suppressed religion. It's a story about how a new, fun tradition got started. But hold on, the plot thickens, because here is the twist that really blows the whole idea of a single, ancient, secret hare right out of the water. Turns out, our bunny had some stiff competition. That's right. Depending on where you lived in German-speaking lands, you might have been waiting for the Easter fox to bring your eggs, or maybe the Easter cuckoo in Switzerland, or even the Easter stork. This just goes to show we're talking about a fluid, regional piece of folklore, not some rigid, ancient belief. The hare just happened to win the popularity contest. So we have this vague goddess idea from the 8th century, and this folklore bunny from the 17th century. How in the world did these two completely separate things get mashed together? Well, this is where the story takes a very deliberate turn. The person who first decided to connect these dots was a famous 19th century folklorist, and it's a name you've definitely heard before, Jacob Grimm. Yes, that Grimm from the Brothers Grimm. Now, Jacob Grimm was a brilliant scholar, absolutely, but it's so important to understand that what he did was speculation. It was a hypothesis. He saw the name Eastrae in Bed's old text, he knew about the German folklore of the Osterhase, and he just kind of theorized a link. He didn't have any actual evidence connecting them. He just thought it was an interesting idea.
And right here, this is basically the recipe for how you cook up a modern myth. You take one single ancient mention of a possible goddess, you find some much later local folklore, you speculate a connection across a 1,000-year gap, and then you serve it up like it's a rediscovered ancient truth.
So that brings us to the big question, right? If the evidence is this flimsy or, non-existent, why do we love this story so much? Why does it keep coming back every year? Well, the answer says a lot more about us today than it does about the ancient world.
I mean, we love the feeling of uncovering a secret, right? Of finding a hidden history that nobody else knows. This story delivers that feeling perfectly, even though it's all based on confusing late folklore with ancient religion and mistaking a 19th century guess for historical fact.
So, what's the real story here? The Easter Bunny is not some pagan relic in disguise. It's a really charming piece of 17th century folklore that attached itself to a much older and completely separate religious holiday. It's a fun cultural add-on, not a religious cover-up. The story of the Easter Bunny is such a great reminder that the most compelling tales aren't always the truest ones. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden histories do we all just accept as fact without ever really checking the evidence? Because sometimes the real history is way more fascinating than the myth.